So the first thing that we're going to talk about here is just the difference between the ACT and the SAT, and basically, the I guess who creates them and how they work and everything like that. So the ACT is created and administered by the ACT Incorporated. It's written by students in grade 11 to 12. The SAT is created by and administered by the College Board, written by students in grades 11 to 12. The College Board also creates the PSAT, also known as the NMSQT, the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test, which is written by students who are younger, sometimes as young as grade 8, although the majority of students who take the PSAT are in grade 10. So there's really not very many reasons that a student in Canada would need to take the PSAT. For the most part, students in Canada who will take one of these tests will only do the SAT or the ACT. The rare exception for a student writing the PSAT, and to be clear, it would not be for the purpose of the National Merit Scholarship. If a student were writing the PSAT in Canada, it would basically be for a school to see a preliminary score that may reflect, that would probably reflect it to some extent, the score that they would receive later on an SAT when they did the real SAT. So in American culture, which is sort of, it always sort of drifts its way up into Canadian culture, the PSAT is a big thing that a lot of kids do when they're in high school. And so when Canadian parents hear about the PSAT, it's often the case that they'll say, well, my kid should probably do this too. But in reality, the PSAT is not much different from the actual SAT. PSAT is the pre-SAT. It's not a practice test. And what it is just a little bit shorter. And it's really used for an earlier gauge of what kind of score a student might get on the actual SAT. So to be clear, the way that it is right now, there's a reading test, writing a language, and then math with a calculator and math without a calculator. That being said, what's been big in the news lately is that the SAT is actually doing an overhaul once again. So the last one that they did was 2015 or 2016, where they made a whole lot of sweeping changes to the test. So they're doing that again for 2023, and I'll get into that shortly. They haven't really said much about the PSAT in terms of what kinds of changes might follow suit with that, but I assume that they will be making some changes to the PSAT as well, if not right at the same time as the SAT. I'm sorry. Then they'll likely make those changes soon after. So for the SAT and ACT, I think in a couple slides I'll talk about the differences in terms of the new test with the SAT. But just to be clear, in terms of the SAT and the ACT, all universities in the United States who require a standardized test will accept either. No schools will require both. There are some test optional schools, and there are more now than there ever have been. So COVID was one factor. And then UC, or University of California, decided to completely get rid of all standardized testing for their entrance, and other schools have followed suit. Actually, I just read that University of California has record numbers of applications this year, partially due to the fact that they've gotten rid of the SAT, or at least that's sort of the speculation. And I'll talk about test optional schools in a minute too, because I do want to touch on that. Both tests are really looking at reading, grammar, math, and writing. The ACT has a science test, which the SAT doesn't. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that science test looks like as we move on. So optional testing, what is optional testing? So there are three sort of categories of schools at this point: test blind, test optional, test required. Test blind schools will not take an SAT score or an ACT score. They just will not look at it. So that is University of California, among others. Test optional schools are schools where they will take the test if you'd like to send it to them, but they don't require it for an application. Test required means that traditionally, a traditional school in the US, you need to submit your SAT or your ACT score by a certain date. So for test optional schools, I really do want to sort of break this down a little bit in terms of standard practice and what happens with those test optional schools. On paper, and part of this is my opinion and part of this is just my take on what's happening, But I watch students that I work with applying to these schools, and I talk to a lot of parents who are looking at other schools. And what ends up happening, and we can look at University of California as an example here, because they had a record number of students who applied to the school, or to their many schools this year, and due in part to the fact that students don't have to submit those scores. What actually happens is that boosts their rates of acceptance. So they actually become a much more competitive school by eliminating the test, where more students who traditionally would not have felt comfortable submitting their test scores to a university are now submitting their test scores to the university. So rather than a pool of, say, just to give a random number, 1,000 applicants, this school is now looking at something like 1,300 applicants. So they're not accepting more students in number. What ends up happening is they're more selective, and they're selecting a smaller percentage of students, which boosts their exclusivity, essentially. So a school like an Ivy League school, where some of them have gone test optional, that really has an impact on the selectivity of their practices and what they're able to do in terms of the number of students that they're actually accepting to their school. So on paper, it looks nice that they're not looking at those scores, but in reality, the students who are submitting SAT and ACT scores are ones who already have a stronger report card to begin with, and are more likely than a student who doesn't feel comfortable submitting their test scores. They're more likely to be accepted to the school. All that being said, Canadian students and international students in general should submit their SAT or ACT score if the school will accept them, because it boosts their ability to actually gain traction in being accepted to that school as an international student. American acceptance is first. International acceptance is usually a little bit more challenging in some ways. Obviously, with athletics and things like that, those are huge advantages that students have. But if it's on merit alone, really submitting as much documentation as possible is recommended. So welcome to those of you who are just joining over the past couple minutes. Just a reminder, if you have any questions for me as I'm talking, or if you'd like me to repeat something or slow down or explain something in greater detail, feel free to leave me a message in the chat. I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. If you have questions at the end, there will be a question period. So let me preface this slide by saying that the SAT is changing as of next year, 2023, for international students. Well, it's changing for everybody, but it's becoming an online test for international students next year, and it will be going fully virtual for everybody, Americans included, as of 2024. But next year, the test is starting its major overhaul, or the major overhaul is being implemented in the test. So this is the last year where this slide actually makes any sense. Next year, it will be a completely different slide, although I've previewed it on a later slide to give you an idea of what's happening, because they haven't released all of the information. Essentially, both tests are about the same length right now, the ACT and the SAT. The SAT has already eliminated their essay, so there is no longer an additional 50-minute essay. The maximum amount of time that your SAT will take you is 3 hours. Your ACT is just under 3 hours. You can still write the essay for the ACT, although it's really falling out of practice. Most people don't write the essay. It's a very difficult essay to write, and it's really unlike any essay that students have been asked to write in school. So if you don't actually need it, at this point, I would usually recommend doing it, or in past I've recommended doing it, up until about 2 years ago. But at this point, it really is not something that students need to worry about. Both tests are looking at reading, which basically means reading comprehension. And then English on ACT is the equivalent of the writing and language on the SAT, which is basically a grammar-focused editing section where you're being asked to make changes to a paragraph where certain things are underlined, and you're playing the role of an editor, essentially. The math section is one section on the ACT for this year. Until next year, the math section is 2 sections on the SAT, where there's a calculator and a no calculator section. And then there is a science section on the ACT. And I'll get a little bit more into what all of these things mean in a minute. So for next year, the SAT will be moving from a 3-hour test to a 2-hour test. And what they're doing is combining the writing and language and reading. So that editing section that I talked about, as well as the reading comprehension section, will be combined into one section. And the math sections will be combined as well, so that there's only one section of math and you'll be allowed a calculator on all of it. So like I said, this will be implemented next year, 2023, for students outside of the United States. Online, it will be implemented for students in the United States next year as well, but it won't be an online test until 2024 for American students. So I know that's a lot of information and it's confusing, but what you need to know is that if your student or if your child is planning on taking the SAT in 2022 this year, they will have a 3-hour test. If they're taking it next year in 2023, they will have a 2-hour test. That being said, again, I always sort of say like it sounds nice, but there's problems. A shorter test is great. Combining the writing and language test and the reading test is potentially a big issue for a lot of students because of the mental gymnastics that happen when you're looking at such a broad number of question types. So traditionally, when you're looking at the reading comprehension section, you have main idea, you have vocabulary and context, you have supporting detail, you have author's tone, those kinds of things. And so you're able to sort of organize you're able to sort of strategize, the order in which you answer questions based on, just understanding how the test works and working through some strategies. When you throw in, comma rules, sentence or comma slices rather, sentence fragments, hyphens and dashes, all of these things that are just like way beyond the standard comprehension of English grammar and really into the nitty-gritty details of how grammar works. When you're moving back and forth mentally between those and reading comprehension questions, that's extremely taxing mentally on a student who's already under pressure to perform well on this kind of test. Again, I will talk more about the question types as we move on, and I'll give you some examples of what these questions might look like. So for now, I've already sort of gone over this. The one thing I do want to mention is that on the ACT, the science section it's actually a bit of a misnomer. It's not a science section where you're being asked to, work with scientific formulas and things like that. Really what it is a collection of reading comprehension, of science-based reading comprehension questions. So you're often given a scientific study or a chart with some data, and you're being asked to analyze that data and report back on information as you would on any other reading comprehension section. So there are some questions that require a little bit of outside knowledge of high school science, but certainly not the majority of questions, and certainly not highly specialized sciences. So if your child is not necessarily a science person, it doesn't mean that they won't do well on the ACT test, and it's not a reason to only consider the SAT. So the scores, again, will change next year. But one thing to, I guess, note is that the average score on the ACT is a 21 and the max is 36. The average score on the SAT is a 1070 and the max score is 1600. You will be getting an email from me after this webinar, and this link will be there. It's the National Center for Educational Statistics. Their College Navigator breaks down average SAT and ACT scores for most universities in the United States. So you can look at samples of, what sort of averages and ranges students have on their standardized test scores who have been accepted to any particular school that you're looking at. So if you're looking at Harvard or a school in that league, not necessarily Ivy League, but that sort of tier of schools, 1600 is the maximum. You're basically looking at a 1530 at a minimum of feeling comfortable with submitting that score. For the ACT, you're looking at a 35. If you're looking at a smaller school or a state school or something like that, oftentimes a 22 or 21 on the ACT is fine. A 1070 or even a 1050 is okay. But it is good to sort of have in mind what kind of score you're working towards, so that you're being realistic with what kind of preparation you're doing, and you're not sort of either overworking yourself if none of the schools that you are applying to require such a high score, or sort of underselling what it is that you need to actually prepare for and then you're shocked to see that you weren't accepted to a school because your score was too low or whatever it may be. So that website, the National Center for Educational Statistics, it is a government website. It's a .gov. it's official data from collected by the U.S. government, and you can learn a lot about the schools that you're applying to or that your child is applying to through there, not just ACT and SAT scores, but really religious affiliation, tuition costs, number of students, all that stuff. It's all compiled there. So I will include that link in the email that's sent out after this webinar. Okay. So this is just about the math topics on the different tests. Most of them, between the two tests, are algebra. There are some pretty tricky questions on both. There are some trick answer choices, and both of them really rely on strategy to work through them. The ACT has a little bit more in terms of trig laws, matrices, probability, and the SAT has a little bit more on systems of equations, polynomials, linear equations. It's just a little bit of a heavier weight between the two on those different concepts. The SAT also has a grid-in section, which I'm not sure if it'll make it to the new SAT test. They haven't released much information, but this is what a grid-in question might look like. So next to this grid, it'll say 36 or 37 or whatever question you're on. And rather than selecting A, B, C, or D, what you're meant to do is calculate your answer and then fill in. If your answer is 51.7, you're going to fill in with your pencil 5, 1, decimal 7, and then write those numbers in those boxes up here. A lot of students lose marks on these because they forget to either pencil them in or write in the answers in the boxes. Honestly, these are, I don't know who created these or what they were thinking or why they've made it this long on the test. They're a pain. It's a source of lost marks because kids forget things, and it's already a stressful test. I hope that they get rid of these for the revised test. Okay, reading comp topics. So they're dense and challenging readings. Most of the readings are either just copyright free from the get-go, or they're old enough that they've been out of copyright so that obviously there's no licensing fees that these test companies want to pay for. So they're older texts, which are often harder to get through for students. Main idea, vocab and context, supporting evidence. SAT has a greater focus on finding supporting evidence for now than the ACT. Both really require a high level of time management skills for students who are taking these tests. It's one of the things that kids really need to work on when they're doing test preparation. Understanding, and this is across the board, not just for the reading section, but really understanding how to manage their time, how to prioritize certain questions over others, how to make sure that they're marking questions to come back to them, how to keep your spirits up when you have 4 questions in a row that you don't understand. Like, these are all higher level executive functioning skills that most kids need some support, if not learning, refining at least. For the writing section, so again, this is the writing and language section or the English test. You're looking at sentence structure, punctuation, concision, diction, and there's a strong emphasis on explicit grammar rules. Again, kids don't learn grammar anymore. We learn sort of naturally pick up on rules, and we're able to identify when things look wrong or look right, but we're not necessarily able to say why. So, when a kid is faced with a question like one that I'll show you in a moment, it can be very difficult for that kid to actually understand how to answer the question. So, and again, we talked about the science already. It's really, it's not about outside knowledge. It's more about interpreting the text that's given to you. So, and we have writing. Okay, so here's an example of a writing test question, just to give you an idea of those implicit grammar or explicit grammar rules that are never explained, but are, I guess, tested on. So here, air travel period, that is underlined. And what you're meant to do is decide which of the 4 options is the best way for the writer to actually write this. So should it be a full stop with a period? Should it be a comma? Should it be a semicolon, or should it be a dash? Most kids don't know what a dash is used for. Most high school teachers, at least one of their high school teachers for English, has told them never to use a semicolon because they're difficult to understand and you don't need to use them. It's only ever an option to use one. So who knows, right? How are you able to, as an 11th grade or 12th grade student, explain that That is until the Hindenburg disaster is a sentence fragment. And so a sentence fragment cannot be a complete sentence. So it cannot be a period. Are you able to explain that in terms of comma rules and semicolons, whether a comma is able to separate a complete clause versus an incomplete clause, or is a semicolon able to do that? So these, again, are just explicit grammar rules that students need to be taught in order to successfully answer these questions. To choose between a comma, a semicolon, and a hyphen in this context is extremely difficult unless you have the rules memorized. An example of a science question. So again, you're given a table. You're asked to interpret the information on the table. The frequency of X-rays bears what relationship to the frequency of radar? So you're just asked to interpret this. This may be an easier question for some students than others, obviously, but just understanding that these are the types of questions that you might be asked, and being ready for them is extremely important. The essay, as I said, is optional, and I don't really encourage students to do it unless they have to. For the ACT, what's happening is you are reading 3 perspectives on a hot topic issue. So it's one that would generally be something like school uniforms, or something where people have obvious differences of opinions, and these are not going to be ones that are going to be politically charged in any way, especially given the current climate of just political derision. We're really looking at some safe topics here. You're reflecting on those 3 perspectives and then providing your own and then relating them to one another. So where a lot of kids go wrong is they'll say, I agree with this one and here's why, but that's not what's happening here. You're meant to really reflect on all 3 and look at more. So a large number of questions really are looking at particular content skills that you need to review. There's new content in math and grammar rules that students have just never encountered. There will always be a few math skills that kids either have never learned or really need to review. And then these strategies that just appear throughout the entire section. Time management skills, wording cues. So those are things where you're looking at words within the questions or answer choices, like evaluate, or a word like most or many or all are sort of like trick words in terms of tricky answer choices. Looking at a strategy like elimination and substitution and many more. Most of the strategies that you learn in preparing for one of these tests is applicable to the other test as well, in terms of ACT, SAT. There's a few that are unique to each test, but for the most part, preparing for one is preparing you for both. With the exception of really the timed practice. Obviously the timing is different on both tests. So, it's best to prepare for the one that you plan to take once you choose which one you're going to take. And then everybody wants to know about retests. So most students take the test more than once. Most students, I would say, take the test twice. Some take it 3 times. In grade 11 in the US, every kid who's going to write their SAT or ACT writes their ACT or SAT in sometime between March and June. So grade 11, March to June, that's test time. Kids who are happy with their scores, send them in. Kids who are not happy with their scores, retake the test in December, October, or November, and then send their applications in. The university application world happens earlier in the US than it does in Canada. Most kids, their schools don't even talk about university applications until we get to the Common App, and we do that in December. It is much earlier in the US. So kids really need to be thinking by the second, third, or I guess post winter break of grade 11, that's crunch time for getting ready for this test. If you haven't already started, which most kids have, that's getting ready for the test and solidifying which schools you're applying to and getting everything in order. A lot of kids will apply over the summer between grade 11 and grade 12. And so they don't have to worry once they've been accepted. Grade 12 is, it's just keeping up your grades so that you don't get, I guess, sort of like accepted. And they do reserve the right to do that based on grade 12 grades. Okay, so you are able to select which scores you want submitted. The ACT currently is the only one that allows super scoring. So super scoring means that you're selecting which scores from which tests you want sent in. It used to be that you were able to say, I want my test 1 English marks sent in, and I want my test 2 math marks sent in, and they would take your English mark from test one that you liked more, and they would take your math mark from your test two that you liked more, and they would put those together and send them to the school, which was amazing, but they don't do that anymore. What superscoring means now is they average your scores across the tests, which can be very helpful for some kids. It can be detrimental for other kids, but you don't have to select that. You can just have one test score sent in. It's entirely up to you. Most students do improve on their second test, obviously. I mean, that's sort of human nature. But what I will mention, and I'll talk a little bit about what preparation looks like in just a moment, but using or assuming that you'll do better on your second test because you've done one test is a bit of a mistake. It's I guess a fallacy in terms of thinking. It's not that one test will prepare you better to do a second test. If you do one test and then just go and take another test without reflecting on it, it really doesn't mean much in terms of the world of score improvements. It's that reflection and ability to identify your areas of weakness and improve on them that are really going to make a difference before you take a second test. So how do we prepare? Number one, start with a simulated time practice test. Hit the ground running. It's much better to just dive in, so to speak, than to get your feet wet. Look at what you're going to be doing. For a lot of kids, especially kids who've never written a standardized test before. So a lot of kids have written the SSAT to get into a private school for high school or middle school, but even then, that's 4 or 6 years ago. Many kids at this point have not even done their OSSLTs, depending on the year, because of COVID. So this really might be the first time in a very long time or ever that a kid is doing a standardized test. Understand what it's about. Do a full test, see how tough it is. And it's not to discourage them. It's really to say, hey, this is what it's all about. This is why we're actually doing the preparation. This is not a walk in the park like a lot of things may have been for you at this point. That first test allows all of us, the people who are helping you prepare, you, your child, to form a baseline. Where are we starting? Are we starting on your SAT at a 990? That's sometimes the case. And you know what? It is what it is. We can move forward from there. But it helps us to form a realistic and meaningful baseline that we're all able to work from. And then from there, we can set some achievable goals. Are you starting at a 990 and expecting to get into Harvard in 3 months? We probably need to rethink that. And that can be a difficult discussion, but it's one that needs to happen at the very beginning. We can also target content exercises when we understand what kids are lacking and what their weaknesses are. Just looking at the timing of things, starting early is best, like it says at the bottom. But that timing really is quite important in terms of understanding how much work actually needs to happen and what kind of work needs to go into it. And then also, I would say the big thing is understanding that progress is different for every student. For everybody's student. That's a glaring typo. But progress is different for every student, not everybody's student. So, for some students to move up from an 1100 to a 1200 is a massive improvement. For a kid to move up from a 1550 to a 1560 is an equally massive improvement. One is 100 points, one is 10 points, but it really depends on where you're starting and what your end goal is. So, I think that's also just really important to keep in mind, that everybody moves at a different pace and we're all starting in different places. And so being realistic about what that looks like, from the very beginning is of utmost importance. So registering, as I said, grade 11 is when most kids do them. You can register as late as 1 month before the test and usually as early as about 3 months before the test. Accommodations are available and you should request them as soon as you apply for the test or apply for the test date or sign up for the test date rather. Schools will not be made aware of accommodations. Don't worry about any sort of like slant or any sort of, schools looking down on the score because your child had an accommodation. If your child gets an accommodation in school, get the accommodation for the test. It's in their best interest. And finally, what's it all worth? So your grades are important. Your test scores are next. Your extracurriculars are last. And then athletics can take first place, depending on the situation. But really, like I said, it depends on the situation. The application essay is also extremely important. So this is separate from the test. This is the actual application essay. Put everything you can into it. Be authentic. Be your true self. It's your one chance to be more than your numbers. Okay, so yeah, to wrap up, it's challenging and you need to prepare. A lot of kids will do very minimal preparation. A few of them are extremely lucky and they're just good test takers with a knack for this kind of stuff. But that is, as they say, the diamond in the rough. Most kids need to prepare for this, which is why there's an entire empire of industries of test prep books and things like that in Princeton Review. Obviously, I'm speaking from a place where that's what I do as well. But there's a reason that that this sort of preparation is used by so many people. Because it's a hard thing to do on your own. Okay, so I will send information about Colleen Reed, who I didn't mention yet, as well as Ingenious Prep, who I didn't mention yet, as well as the National Center for Educational Statistics in an email. Colleen Reed is a college navigation counselor for the US schools as well as as well as Canadian schools. She's a wonderful resource if you're looking for somebody to bounce some ideas off of in terms of figuring out which schools are best for your kid. Ingenious Prep is more of the application process that's sort of it's their ingenious application prep. So if you want help with actually putting your application or your portfolio together, they're really wonderful in terms of helping. A lot of the people who work there are former admissions officers at some really elite American universities. So yeah, I'm gonna end my presentation here. It's a little bit earlier than usual. I did get through things rather quickly, but I usually have about 10 minutes or 15 minutes of questions. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask right now in the chat box. Like I said, if you have any further questions that you don't think of right now, or you don't want to ask right now, you can certainly email me at the email that you see on the screen. It'll also be in the email that you're sent after this. The final thing is, if you decide that you'd like to get some help in terms of doing some preparation, and you'd either like to chat with me about some more things, or you'd like to just dive in and book a diagnostic test for your kid, like I said, that first timed practice test, that there will be a link for registering for a diagnostic test in the email as well. The diagnostic test is its own standalone charge. It's a $340 charge that covers the cost of the test itself, as well as the time that it takes for us to put together an analysis for your child. So you'll get about a 3-page analysis of their performance on the test, as well as some recommendations for preparation in terms of timing and when we should start and how many hours might be appropriate and things like that. So that will all be in that email. If you don't have any questions, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Like I said, I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll stick around for 10 minutes or so, just to wait for some questions if any come up. And if not, have a wonderful evening. Thank you for being here. So a question just came in about accommodations. So thank you for that. Yes, in terms of accommodations, if your child gets an accommodation in school, whether it be extra time on a test, so usually that means time and a half, whether that means testing in a smaller, quieter environment, those accommodations can be requested from the SAT or the ACT. Usually what's required is proof of accommodation from your child's school. So usually be the resource person or a guidance counselor who would attest to the fact that your child does in fact receive that accommodation in school. So usually what will happen, not usually, what will happen is you'll put that person's contact information in when you request the accommodation, and the ACT or the SAT, whichever you're applying for, will contact that person directly to say, hey, this kid registered for the test. They're going to need this accommodation. Is that something that you actually give them? So they don't need a copy of a psych ed or anything like that. What they need is just the sort of nod of approval from the school. Yeah. Okay, so it doesn't look like there are any further questions coming in. I will stick around for a few more minutes, but like I said, thank you very much, all of you, for being here. I appreciate your time. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at the email here on the screen, or my email will be included in that follow-up email that you get from our marketing team. So I appreciate your time. I'll stick around for another 2 minutes or so, and if there's no other questions, we'll end this session at that point. Again, thank you, and have a wonderful evening.